folks, you're very, very welcome to this joint event on LGBTI family rights with the Western Region Family Resource Centre and Network and LGBT Ireland. My name is Paula Fagan and I'm CEO of LGBT Ireland, and I'm the chair of this evening's panel discussion. Today marks International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia and Biphobia, and I suppose the reason we're having this event tonight is to mark that day. And we've come a very long way in Ireland, which is fantastic, around the rights and recognition and visibility of LGBTI people. We've come a long way in terms of, or we've made I would say, a lot of progress in terms of LGBTI family rights, but there's a lot more still to do. And I suppose that's really the focus of this evening, is to talk through what law is in place for LGBTI families and those planning parenthood, and then what families and what situations aren't covered. So that's really what we're focusing in on this evening. So to introduce you to my very learned panel, to my left here is Anne-Marie Whelan, and Anne-Marie Whelan is a barrister, and she's also a very important member of our legal strategy group in LGBT Ireland. And Anne-Marie has been working and really guiding us and giving us great wisdom and advice on parenting rights and family rights in Ireland. So she's going to take some questions today and just try and outline the law as accessibly as only Anne-Marie can. We're also going to hear from Fiona McDonough Delaney about her experience. Herself and her wife Sadie have been through this court process, the process that is available to register their son Oisín. So Fiona's going to outline their experience, and unfortunately it was a difficult experience and a challenging one. So for those in attendance as well who are legal practitioners, we're hoping to really, I suppose, update you on the law and just to alert you to some of the challenges. We're also delighted to be joined by Brendan O'Loughlin, and Brendan's the Assistant Registrar General from the General Registration Office down in Roscommon. And we're also delighted to be joined by TJ Fleming, who's the Registrar General. And I suppose I would like to say both of you have been amazingly proactive in supporting the community to get their children's births re-registered for some of us and then registered for new births. So look, it's fantastic. I suppose it shows your commitment really for both of you here this evening, and this isn't the first event you've done for us, so we're really delighted and appreciate you being here. So I'm going to kick off. There's a chat function there, and please put your questions into the chat and we will get to them. But we're going to just open up with a few initial questions to get the discussion going, and then we will revert to the questions as well. And there'll be plenty of time to ask your questions. And if we can't answer them tonight, we can get back to you, and we'll put information up on our website, lgbt.ie. So to kick off, Anne-Marie, I'm going to start with you. And I suppose, sure, you know, there's been, even since back as far as marriage equality, we've seen headlines in the newspaper saying same-sex parents can be legally recognised. And I suppose we've seen a lot of newspaper headings. Some of the law came into place last May, so some people are legally recognised, but some aren't. So we might start there, Anne-Marie, if you could talk us through what law came in to effect last May and who does that cover?
Okie doke, yeah. So the Children and Family Relationships Act 2015, certain parts of that, parts 2 and 3, commenced from the 4th of May 2020. And just to explain that, you know, that piece of legislation was actually enacted prior to the marriage equality legislation, and it did give lots of couples, same-sex couples, hope that we would be covered, you know, that we would be able to start families and be legally recognised as parents of our children. Unfortunately, due to a number of different issues, primarily drafting errors, we had to fight, and you'll be well aware of the fight, Paula, in terms of getting parts 2 and 3 fixed and ultimately commenced. So they did actually commence on the 4th of May 2020. Now, in terms of what they covered, those provisions are solely concerned with donor conception in very, very narrow circumstances. And I'll repeat the date. The 4th of May 2020 is very, very important in terms of 2 different types of recognition regimes that came into effect from that date. And the key element is when the child is conceived. So if you had a child that was conceived prior to the 4th of May 2020, they could possibly be covered under the retrospective regime, but for children conceived after that date, they may be covered under the prospective regime. So we're only beginning to see those registrations now over the past couple of months, because most children do take the 9 months and try to fit that timeline in terms of conception. But just to address the pre 4th of May 2020, the retrospective coverage, which I know Fiona would have benefited from, I myself have benefited from, and Paula to some extent have benefited from, in being able to apply to the courts to get a declaration of parentage. Now, that option is only available with respect to the narrow criteria set out in section 20 of the CFRA. And within that, there's 2 key elements. One is location, and the other is donor type. And with respect to location, the CFRA only covers births in Ireland. So any child born outside of Ireland is not covered by the CFRA. But also in terms of conception, the conception procedure, I suppose, in terms of becoming pregnant had to have occurred in a clinic, albeit that for retrospective coverage, it could have been a clinic in Ireland or abroad, provided that the clinic or the person performing the procedure was in fact authorized under their legislation to carry out that procedure. And in terms of the donor type, any type of donor, so whether it was anonymous, identifiable, or known, albeit that Irish clinics weren't in the process of enabling procedures using known donors. But if you had identifiable donor or an anonymous donor, there is scope to be retrospectively recognised with a court application. Now, the court application that we went through in Dublin was relatively straightforward. I know Fiona's going to speak to the process out west, and unfortunately that wasn't such a positive experience. But it happens in the district court. Both parents are agreeable to it, and if you can document that the procedure occurred with that criteria being met, you can easily make that application. And that's the retrospective piece. So children conceived prior to the 4th of May 2020. Now, in terms of children that were conceived after the 4th of May 2020, there's a completely different regime, there's a completely different process. So firstly, in terms of location, recognition only applies with respect to conceptions that occur in Irish clinics. So there's no longer provision going forward with respect to foreign procedures to become pregnant. It still applies to Irish births only, so there isn't a discrepancy there. But then in terms of the donor, the only permissible donor types are identifiable or known donors. So the use of anonymous donor types has been effectively outlawed by the CFRA, and part of that is because the legislation established what's called the National Donor Conceived Register, which means that the donor has to be identifiable at some point for information to go on that register for the benefit of the child. Now, in terms of registration, thankfully for conceptions after the 4th of May that do meet that criteria, it's pretty much automatic. So there's a very much simplified process, and there is an additional piece of paperwork in terms of a statutory declaration which confirms that the birth and the conception complied with that criteria, but it can still be registered in the normal way ultimately reaching the likes of Betty and TJ in terms of signing off on a birth cert. So there's no need for a court application. Recognition summarizes it enough for you, Paula.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. So there's questions coming in already, and we will come to those questions, so don't worry. So Anne-Marie, that was fantastic. So I suppose leading from that, so if you're a female couple and you do qualify, if you have a child already and you do qualify under the Section 20, so the retrospective provisions, you get your court order, and I'm going to come to Fiona in a second, but firstly I might go to you, Brendan, then to outline. So say if a couple do have their court order, saying they're both the intended parents, and TJ, whichever one of you wants to take this, what happens then from your end, so in terms of re-registering that birth, or how does that process happen?
Yes, so Paul, I'll take that, I think. Will I, TJ, is that okay? Yeah, yeah, just we have information, by the way, just up on if you go into the government website and just type in registrations as well. We have a lot of information up there for people as well, okay, just as an aside from this. But what we do is, once you have your court order, in effect, you've gone through the process as far as we're concerned. So our job then is to confirm a number of things. And one of them really is to make sure that the parents, what labels they want. So we'll ask the parents, if it's two females, for instance, do you want to be known as mother parent or parent parent? And for re-registrations, because the child's birth has already been registered, we will also ask if you want to change the surname that is currently down for the child, which happens, and that can incorporate both of the new parents' surnames. And basically, once both parents sign off on that, our job is effectively done, because the work has been done at the court level, and it's not our job to look behind the court order. Once it's come in and it's been verified, we're quite happy to accept the bona fides of it. And what we do is we have an email address on the website, and we ask parents to use that email address when they're dealing with us. At that email address, and Paul, we'll put all this up later on for you, so people can have it. And it's a dahr@welfare.ie, and we have a team that is led by Philip Murphy and Sharon Harrington, and they deal with all of the re-registrations using that email. So the parents will have filled in the form that's also on the website on gov.ie, and we basically will communicate with the parents. So we make sure everything is filled in properly. Both parents have consented, as I say, and effectively it's quite painless. We've normally turned over the applications in 2 weeks, so we have a very good track record, and we work very well with the HSE, who do the physical part of the re-registration process. Obviously, with everything that's going on at the moment in terms of the technical attack on the HSE, that may lead to slight delays, but just slight delays. We're not sure exactly how it will impact, but we've had a very positive experience so far. And without going, just to give you an idea of numbers, we have had, since the outset, 127 births re-registered. So that's a fabulous figure. That's from May last year. So that's really good. And bearing in mind the courts have been closed for a good part of that year. So it's a fabulous number. And I have more detail that I was going to go into, Paula, as we went along, but does that cover?
That's great, Benny. So just to recap then, so it's all over email, really, isn't it?
Absolutely.
The parents get their, so they get, once you have your court order, you fill out the form on your website, and then you send in the paperwork, and then you'll get your re-registered birth cert in the post.
Yeah, well, we have to apply for the birth certificate slightly separately, but the big thing really we're trying to get across is the actual process of inputting these parent details into the register of births is the big thing. The birth certificate is the verification, if you like, that entry is now in the record of births, and it'll be there for forever. As long as parents go to any office, they'll get a copy of the brand new input on it. So there are issues at the moment, obviously, with COVID in terms of attending birth registration offices, and also some issues in terms of how quickly birth certificates are being issued. But the birth certificate is literally just the proof, if you like, of what is recorded on the register of births. So it's a very important piece of paper, but that's what it effectively does. It indicates that person is a parent to that child, and that's how we do it. Yeah.
Thanks, Brendan. And final question then. So we saw the lovely photos recently and piece on the news about the family, the first couple to have their child that didn't have to go through the court process because they were past the 5th of May when they conceived. So what happens there? If you're a couple now that you're expecting a baby next month, what would your registration look like?
Well, first of all, you will have dealt with the clinic, and the clinic will have given you a piece of paper, very important piece of paper, and that piece of paper will have outlined the consent of the person giving birth and the person being named as parent, that they are in fact going to be the parents of this child. That's a very important piece of paper. And with that piece of paper, then our own office will give you a statutory declaration, as Anne-Marie mentioned, and that is filled in by the parents as well. And again, it's just the parents reaffirming that they will be the parents of that child, and the donor will not be in law the parent of the child. So once those processes have gone through, the actual birth itself, so a birth process is when a child, any child is born, a birth notification is set up on the system, and that's for all births. And then for the registration of a child, the only slight deviation is that those two pieces of paper are needed by the couple to confirm when we register the event, to confirm that we're registering the event. And it again, as Anne-Marie touched on, there's no court orders, nothing like that involved, because the birth has not been registered. This is the first registration of the birth, and hopefully the only registration of the birth. And so that couple are the parents of that child from the date that the birth is registered.
Okay, thanks, Brendan. TJ, do you want to add anything there before I go on to Fiona?
No, not particularly. Brendan is the expert. There's no point repeating it. Questions may come up. Maybe just to simply say thanks very much for including us, and thinking that we have some expertise we can share with you. Certainly we can, and we can share some of our experience of the process to date. But what we've tried to do is focus very much on the parents who are trying to get a difficult and complex legal process through what can appear to be an arduous system. So for our part of it, we've tried to streamline the whole process from that part that we own. Now, obviously, we can't interfere with court processes, but we've tried to influence the development of court rules around this to try and ensure that A, there's knowledge of a process, B, that it's not particularly complicated, C, there's nothing particularly new in it. Orders of parentage are not something that's new to the courts. But I would say, you can criticize the courts for perhaps, the scrutiny they apply to it. It's a hugely important piece of work that they're doing in terms of their granting parentage or acknowledging parentage and ensuring that the constitutional rights of the child to be registered and to have an identity are upheld and are beyond challenge and reproach. So, okay, suffer a little bit of inconvenience, but for the long-term good of the parents and the child, it's not, we would hope, that much of an inconvenience. And okay, there's a little bit of an additional work in terms of, okay, the clinic certification and the statutory declaration for the parents one to say they are the parent and the other to say they accept the other person as the parent of the child, and the other parent acceding to that recognition. That's not particularly unusual for birth registrations where parents of children are not married. There is an automatic recognition for some births where parents are married, which is not particularly helpful either if the spouse is not the parent of the child, which brings its own inconveniences. So from our part, what we've tried to do is to centralize as much of the bureaucracy, and there isn't a lot, and that people have one point to deal with, which is through the single email, and educate local registrars then, to complete the process. And for the most part, re-registrations, I think, are being, completed within a few working days, and we've committed ourselves to turning this around within, 3 or 4 working days, if at all possible.
Thanks, TJ, and absolutely, I think.
But we welcome the feedback and the criticism if there are.
No, not at all.
Ideas about, how we might improve or how we might respond better to parents in the situations, either, pre-May or, post-May 2020.
Thanks, TJ, and absolutely the feedback certainly we've got so far is once they get to you folks, then it's really positive, and even just the way you've handled applications, and I know you've even sent some personal letters, and that's really lovely, I think, because a lot of us are waiting a long time, so it is a special moment for the families, and I think you really recognise that, so a big thank you for that, actually. So I suppose just coming to Fiona now, because so before the parents get to you, if it's a child that already existed or was conceived before the 5th of May, there is this need for a court process. So Fiona, you might tell us about your own experience. You had a difficult experience in the court in June, so you might just tell us about that.
Right, Paula, hi. Yeah, when the legislation came in place in May, we contacted our solicitor straight away, and we said, look, let's get our names in, get in before the judge in our local district, and so we did that, and we got into them, and we had our session, and we probably were the very first gay couple that he had seen since this legislation came in. So whether that was part of the concern on his end, I don't know. But anyway, we went before him. We had presented. We had our letter from the clinic. We had all their paperwork in order, let's say, and we had, like as Anne-Marie said, we had conceived the child within a clinic within Ireland with a non-anonymous donor. So we'd done everything that had been asked of us, and because, like Anne-Marie said, we knew since 2015 that this legislation was coming. So we had attended a clinic with that in mind all the time, that eventually this would come through. So we were going in full of the joys of life. This could be wonderful. We could have our meeting and we'd be out the door again and we'd be parents. But unfortunately, it didn't go that well. He wasn't very agreeable. He didn't take it so kindly. He kind of questioned the reality of the existence of a father, and really questioned where this person lived, and did we know him, and where was he, even though he had the paperwork and the application in front of him which confirmed that it was a donor sperm that was used. So that aside, then he said that he wasn't accepting that my wife was could stand for our child and our child's best interest. So my wife is his birth mother. So she was authorizing the parental order, like she was standing for Oisin to say that, that she accepted that I was going to be his parent. And but he didn't accept that that was enough of a voice for our son. So he wanted us to bring in a third person to represent him. Now, at the time, this was in June 2020, so in the height of COVID pandemic. So he asked if we had parents that would be agreeable to come in. Now, from many points, we didn't agree with it at all in the first place, because as far as we were concerned, we'd planned this child for a long time. You know yourself, if you go through a fertility clinic, it's a very long process. It's our family, so why would somebody outside of our family unit know what is best for our child? So that was, we fundamentally didn't agree with what he was saying. And also then with the whole COVID scenario, it's like we cannot be bringing our elderly parents to court, and this was in an in-person court, it wasn't online. And mask wearing was not mandatory as well at the time. We were the only ones wearing masks in the entire court. So I didn't want to bring an elderly person into that setting, and I didn't feel it was necessary. And so then he was offering the option, came down then on that we needed to inform TUSLA as a representative for our son, that this was in his best interest for me to be named as his second parent. And our solicitor, you know, really fought our corner on our behalf, you know. Ultimately, he actually took the moment to, he actually requested that we leave his room, and he was going to his, he adjourned to go to his own room, and he rang the president of the district court to get their advice, because we informed him that cases were being held in Dublin, and there had been cases in Limerick, and they had been passed. The exact same scenario as ourselves, the exact same paperwork, the exact same conception of birth stories of ours, and they were being granted without any, you know, problems. So he rang the president of the district court, and I believe that the president told him to go ahead and grant it. Everything was in order, but he refused, and he told us that the case was adjourned and we were to return with our third party, whether it was to get a family member, or he would get the court clerk to appoint TUSLA to come in on our behalf. Now, that was it. We were adjourned. We were never before him again. Our solicitor went to him another time at a different court proceeding in Loughrea to argue our case again, without us being present, but to push our case to him again. And again, he wasn't budging on it. He wanted a third party. And so we spoke to our solicitor, what was our options? If we were to appear to him, our option was to appear to him again, as scheduled at the next meeting, without our third person, but then we would be faced with probably being refused and needing to go to the High Court to get it appealed. And we really didn't want to go through that, not just for financial reasons, but when you're hearing on the news that this is a celebration thing, and loads of our friends in the community were getting theirs granted, and the exact same scenario, you don't want, it's a very memorable moment. You don't want it to be an argumentative moment. You know, we fought long enough to get here. So why should we be fighting just because this is a rural court compared to a city court? So we said, no, we were not going to go ahead with this. What we said we'd do is, this was a roaming judge, he wasn't a regular judge, so we said we'd wait and adjourn our case until the regular judge comes back, and we'll try again. Basically, we'll try our luck again. So it was adjourned. So that was June 2020, and it was adjourned, and we didn't get before our judge then until October, the end of October 2020. And so the exact same, went through the whole thing. He read the paperwork, and at this stage he obviously was a bit more learned about it, because he had was aware of other cases that had been passed around the country. And he said he was just going to double check whether the court rules were in place, and he presumed if they were, he would authorize it. And he left it at that, and he says, so take it that it's done, and if there's any issues, we'll be covered. So we left the court, and I think later that week the court rules were published. And I mean, it was literally that week, and I remember thinking, will I ring the solicitor and tell him that the court rules have been published? I'll ring him on Monday, and sure to God, the parental order actually came in the post the following week, so there was no need to actually chase it up anymore. We were delighted, you know, we were delighted. We finally got it, and I mean, the tears and the screams in the kitchen when the post, you know, and I remember, like, as a testament to Benny and everyone at the registration office, I mean, we rang the registration office in Galway City, and sure, I'd say one on the phone, she knew well we were so excited, and she was congratulating her. We were our first couple through to them too, you know, so it was lovely. It was lovely from then on, and that's what we had wanted from the offset, and that's what made it so difficult. It was like, you know, when you tick all the boxes and you do everything that's in your power, and then you're still met with someone that is reading the document differently than the other judges in the district court around the country. And so we were glad we had postponed it, but yeah, it was a bit of an unnecessary journey along the way, really, you know.
Thanks, Fiona, and thanks for sharing that. It was a difficult time, and I think that's one of the reasons why we thought we'd have the focus on this issue tonight, because I think the family resource centres down in the Western region, they do a lot of work at providing information to people. Also, they do a lot of work with solicitors and other legal practitioners, so trying to get the word out. And I think it was a new law, and certainly in Dublin we were able to get dedicated days in the court, but we heard differing experiences in different courts around the country. So it is important, I think, to have these events so people can get much just clearer and more comfortable with the law, because it shouldn't be the case that, certainly my experience, Amy, you were probably the same, it was so affirming in the Dublin court, and it shouldn't be any different anywhere else. So I might just come back to Anne-Marie on the point that the judge kind of raised with you, Fiona, just so we can talk a little more on that, because I know it has come up in other hearings, this idea of the next friend. And it's in the legislation that even though, you know, we've raised our children from birth and so on, that there isn't in the legislation that the next friend needs to sign the form, Anne-Marie. Is that correct, or what way does it work?
Yeah, so I suppose the CFRA doesn't fully cover off all the general rules that the district court has to follow or any other court has to follow, but the general rules in terms of children and in terms of parties to proceedings is that they are represented, you know, if they're not able to represent themselves. And the default position for children is usually a next friend. And in, you know, so many cases, the next friend is the parent. So like, it makes perfect sense for a birth mother to be the appointed next friend for the child. And, you know, we certainly, in terms of the paperwork, the birth mother was by default named as the next friend to try and deal with that representation piece, because the child is named as a party to the application. Now, there are other provisions in law in terms of appointing what are called guardian ad litems to represent children, but that's usually in cases that involve conflict or other issues with respect to that particular child. Whereas these applications are consent applications. You know, it's the birth mother in all of these cases consenting to their partner becoming the second parent of that child. And there's no conflict, there's no issues. You know, the best interests of the child principle, yes, has to be at the forefront of all of these things, but at the same time, you know, the birth mother should be an appropriate person for that. So it's unfortunate that the judge decided to pick up on that as a particular issue. I find it very, very disappointing that any judge would bring TUSLA into the conversation where A, there wasn't legal provision in the CFRA for that type of order to be made, but B, just, I think we all would be somewhat shocked to hear TUSLA mentioned and, you know, juxtaposed against the best interests of our own children in terms of trying to make a consent order in the district court. So yeah, very unfortunate. Thankfully, you know, ultimately had a happy ending, and I'm so glad that Fiona did get her order in the end. But yeah, I can't imagine the extra weight after having waited for the legislation to be commenced, for the court processes to reopen post-COVID, and then all of a sudden to be confronted with a somewhat obstructive judge. So, you know, certainly, and you know this, Paula, like in Dublin, we had none of those issues because we had a judge who had educated themselves, had been involved in setting aside dedicated time to ensure that, you know, they were appropriately dealt with, that they were considered, but the criteria for proving those cases was consistent throughout that, and it definitely made life an awful lot easier. But fundamentally, it shouldn't matter. You know, the courts are the courts of Ireland. you know, and they should be applying the same process.
And you know as well, Anne-Marie, sorry, my screen's frozen.
We can hear you, Fiona.
Oh, you can, sorry. Another thing as well that I had an issue with him saying, you know, to bring in a parent or a sibling of myself or my wife to represent the child. I felt as well that that was a difficult position to put a person in, especially as a gay couple. You're presuming that your family of origin is actually supportive of your relationship in the first place.
Yeah.
And if they're not, and if they're vindictive, you could possibly be facing putting them before a judge, saying something negative about you in the first place, because, you know, it's an awful presumption, you know, and that's why I was like, no way did I want to go ahead with that. Like, yeah, we could have, but at the same time, like my sister at the time was living in Dublin. I mean, she's not going to take a day off work to come down and sit in the car park at the courthouse for the whole day, you know. I couldn't have asked her to do that, you know. And yeah, I just felt it was an awful precedence, because as well, if the next case, you're presuming that they do have that family support, you know.
Yeah, I'm not, certainly that's terribly disappointing from a court's perspective. I suppose we had worked with the court service in developing and making sure the court rules were in place, and court clerks had the necessary knowledge of the necessary procedures. Of course, what happens are that you know, when a case of any novelty, shall we say, comes before a court, and maybe the legal practitioners might be able to comment better on this, we often find that there are delays and curious questions raised, because they often find their way back to our office on, you know, registration matters, marriage matters, that you know, relating to registration law, simply because the type of cases don't feature that frequently before judges. And if you have a judge who's not familiar with the territory, as you said, it's a roaming judge, well, that's a kind appellation that you're giving to the gentleman. But I mean, there is no excuse for the ignorance. At least, I suppose, eventually they did educate themselves as to the process, and hopefully if they come to the procedure the next time, they'll be familiar enough with it. I think judges are terribly fearful of making court orders that might later come to be corrected, or maybe a source of embarrassment for them. I mean, that is part and parcel of some of the work that we do in the General Registration Office, is to seek the correction of court orders where they simply are not in accordance with the law, or in accordance with what we understand to be the court rules on a particular issue. But that's fine for us, because we possibly deal with this stuff week in, week out. But if you're a judge that only deals with it once in a blue moon, which is why we moved to centralize the registration process, at least some parts of the administration of it, centrally, so that we weren't having maybe local registrars dealing with, to them, appear to be unfamiliar cases, and then all sorts of doubts entering into their minds, and seeking guidance which they wouldn't possibly be able to seek there and then, and put people off to another date.
And I think,
yeah, I'm
sorry,
TJ. When we do introduce new and complex processes, you get these unfortunate circumstances of people not having properly educated themselves, or being risk adverse, I suppose.
And I suppose in relation to this, just to clarify, because I can see a question there, someone's asking, why do we still need to apply to court for prospective cases conceived after the 4th of May? And you don't, I suppose, is the answer to that. What we're talking about here is children and children conceived before the 4th of May. So if you conceive after the 4th of May, then you go through the registration. You don't have to go to court. It's a straightforward registration, as Brendan spoke about earlier. So just to clarify that, so there is, in a sense, there's a finite number, isn't there, of parents that will actually have to go through this process. There's quite a few of us now, in fairness, like at 125, there's a lot more people to go through the process. So I would say, look, reach out to your Family Resource Centre, reach out to LGBT Ireland if you do end up in a situation like Fiona and Sadie. And then we'll see what we can do as well to try and support you. But hopefully, as TJ said, as the more familiar judges get and the more education that we can do, hopefully with that this won't happen, and it should be a straightforward process. I do want to move on because we have a fair. Sorry, go ahead.
Paul, I'm just asking a quick question with regards to the 4th of May and conception before or after the 4th of May. Is conception considered when the embryo is created or when the embryo is implanted?
Anne-Marie, you're on mute.
Implanted, so it's conception in terms of when the pregnancy would be considered to commence as a result of a DAR procedure.
So if a couple have a frozen embryo there since 2015, but they don't use it till 2021, 2022, they will be a prospective application.
Yes, but just to say that there's some people might get worried in terms of, you know, if they used anonymous donors pre that time, there is actually an exemption in terms of embryos that were formed beforehand, so that criteria doesn't apply to embryo cases.
Brilliant, thanks.
That's why I don't go anywhere without Anne-Marie. I even go, when I go to the shops, I'm like, where's Anne-Marie? I know. So I'm going to move on a little bit now because, sorry, Benny, go ahead.
Just to clarify, sorry, maybe I misheard the question and my connection went down a bit there, but the registrations, the donor registrations, they will have to have gone through the clinic prior to the procedure. And I think and I think you highlighted yourself that there are people who are caught in the sense that they may not have gone through the process after last May, and may have done a procedure without going through the registration part of it, which is that you get consent from the clinic prior to the procedure. There's consent forms that have to be filled in. And I think some people are caught in that they didn't know that, and they did a procedure without going through that with a clinic. And they're kind of caught, I think, am I right there, Anne-Marie? They're kind of caught in the middle.
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying there, Benny. So, like, I mean, I have come across couples who may have purchased donor gametes or have, like that, may have embryos abroad who cannot avail of the automatic recognition, even if they have a DAR procedure in Ireland, because the exemption, the wording of the exemption sections don't cover off a clinic having not acquired those before the 4th of May. So those situations are actually quite complex. But in terms of the DAR procedure itself, so if somebody had formed embryos in Ireland and they're in situ in a clinic, they will sign consent procedures prior to the implantation. And as far as I'm aware, that kicks off the process in terms of compliance with the CFRA, and that's fine from an Irish perspective.
It's anybody who did the procedure after the legislation commenced, but didn't go through the formal process with the clinic, is what I'm talking about.
Okay, yeah, okay.
So prior to the legislation, we will re-register all of those births. But if the procedure happened after the commencement of the legislation, they're stuck in kind of no man's land. They can't re-register, and they can't register because they haven't got the consent form from the clinic prior to the procedure.
Okay.
I hope I'm getting that right, but anyway, we can.
I'd just be hopeful that the clinics weren't actually performing procedures without following the criteria
exactly.
post 4th of May. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, folks, so we'll move on then, and I know there's a lot of questions and I am going to come to them, so don't worry. So Emma, you might just give us a whistle stop of who then isn't covered by the Children and Family Relationships Act, and therefore at this moment in time as we speak, that is the only legislation in Ireland that does cover some same-sex parents. So you might just say who isn't covered.
Yeah, so like the Children and Family Relationships Act was the first time that we had some recognition for same-sex couples, but only with respect to kind of female-led couples where one partner is going to carry the pregnancy. So in that particular context, you know, there's no provision here for gay dads, for example. There's zero provision for surrogacy. There's no provision because of the criteria and the way that it's being formulated. There is reliance on clinics. So there's no provision for home insemination. There's certainly no provision within the CFRA with respect to recognition of foreign births. So we're only seeing, I suppose, coverage for a small number of same-sex couples who happen to be same-sex female couples who follow the exact criteria as it's laid down in the CFRA. And going forward, that means only clinic procedures in Ireland for conception, only identifiable sperm donors going forward, having the child in Ireland. So nothing outside of that is covered. And while we're aware of certain draft legislation that has been pending for a number of years, primarily to cover surrogacy, we have no time frame and we've no pathways that we can see in the near future with respect to expanding that coverage for numerous reasons.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. And I was on at a meeting this morning with others, with Minister O'Gorman, and I suppose while they are hopeful, they are looking at ways to cover international surrogacy. They are looking at ways to broaden out the Children and Family Relationships Act. They don't have a time frame, a clear time frame on that yet. So I suppose as it stands at the moment, all of those pathways, I suppose for anyone planning a pregnancy at the moment that's on this call, really there isn't a legal pathway yet. No. So I suppose yeah, sorry, Anne-Marie, go ahead.
Sorry, just to clarify as well, the one thing that I haven't addressed fully is reciprocal IVF, in case people are concerned as to whether that is covered or it isn't. And just to say that we were genuinely concerned that it wasn't covered because there was a requirement for retrospective cases that the donor was unknown to the parents, and that somewhat implied that the parent providing their eggs wouldn't be recognised. We've since seen cases actually progress. We've had confirmation, absolutely. There was never a prospective bar to reciprocal IVF being covered, but retrospectively it appears that it is, and the same declaration of parentage process can be utilised for reciprocal IVF retrospectively, and prospectively should be covered, provided it's in an Irish clinic, and the same criteria that would apply with respect to the donor type.
Okay, good. So that's another step forward. I suppose it's another pathway that is hopefully covered, or we're pretty certain it's covered.
There's definitely been one district court declaration of parentage for reciprocal IVF couple, and also we know that there's at least one further application pending and they're just waiting for their court date.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. So I'm going to move on to the questions in a moment, but before I do, I was going to ask Brendan or TJ to answer this. So I suppose part of this process is to have a donor registrar. So if you have a child using donor gametes, your child that is registered, and then your child can access that information. So you might just clarify, because I know in the Children and Family Relationships Act, that can happen when a child is 18 and requests their birth certificate. Is that the way it happens, or could you clarify?
Yeah, what's currently legislated for is that there is a marker that's put on the registration system. Now, that marker isn't visible to, it's not visible, first of all, on the birth certificate, and it's only visible to a registrar on, if you like, the far side of the system. So what the law currently sets out is that if that donor child is not aware that they are a donor child, that when they come to get a copy of their birth certificate after they reach 18 years of age, the registrar is compelled to inform them that there is information about them on the donor assisted human registrar. So that is how they would find out. They would find out from a person behind the counter. And that is coming down the line in 18 years' time.
And just to be clear, Brendan, as well, because obviously tonight we're focused on LGBTI parented families, but this law is in place for all donor conceived children. So it could be a heterosexual couple as well that applies to.
Yeah, we have registered children to heterosexual couples as well.
Yeah.
So the same rule will apply. So if the child is not informed prior to them reaching 18 years of age, that is how they will be informed.
Yeah. And I think that's a very important piece of information to get out as well, for people to be aware of that. And it's one of the issues that we are raising with government around that. Just is that the best way? It doesn't sound like the best way forward, but that's another one.
And the reality is, the reality is going forward, Paula, like the idea in 18 years' time of a local office where people would walk in to get a copy of a birth certificate. I mean, we can't see it. We have other plans in the registration system where, we just can't see somebody walking into an office in 18 years' time. So how they would find out? So,
I know. Okay, thanks for that clarity, Brendan. So I'm going to go to the questions now, and I'll start with, there's a question in from Aoife, and Aoife's asking, and I think this one is probably for you, Anne-Marie. Can my local GP administering registered donor sperm insemination be seen as a DAHR facility? Namely, can myself and my wife be seen as the parents on the birth cert by going through my doctor rather than a fertility clinic? Because they want to avoid the fertility clinic if they can. Do you have the answer?
Yeah, the legislation is somewhat unusual in terms of how it defines what's called a DAR facility. So DAR facility is basically defined with respect to where the procedure occurs, but that does take into the fact that the majority of the CFRA actually is designed to regulate DAR facilities. So the idea that fertility clinics are primarily the target of this legislation comes from the fact that they can be inspected. They are subject to so many regulations around, maintaining donor consents, maintaining the paper trail, the intended parent consents, and liaising with the donor conceived register. In terms of all of those obligations, they're imposed upon a DAR facility. Now, in terms of whether a GP clinic could be perceived or qualify as a DAR procedure, there may be other processes that would have to happen in the background, but it certainly wouldn't be a way around covering home insemination. Home insemination is definitely not covered under the CFRA, but in terms of a GP conducting an insemination, that brings into question other issues. And that is the, I suppose, qualifications of the GP, and in terms of their practice, whether that would be capable of being inspected by the Department of Health officials, which is provided for in other parts of the legislation. I understand where this may come from. I know that when the legislation commenced, sperm banks had previously been willing to post out sperm to any location, but as soon as they became aware of the restriction in terms of DAR procedures, I know a number of them have decided to only post or deliver gametes to registered practitioners, and that's how the clinics are capable of still accessing gametes for procedures. But I'm not sure how a GP, just operating as a GP practice, would be able to meet the other requirements of the regulation without something in between.
And absolutely essential then, isn't it, for when they get to Brendan or TJ, they have that form that says that intended, or the donor has consented. So that might, so it's all of that paperwork trail, isn't it, that's so important. Okay, so I'm thinking, yeah, so it's, I suppose it's one to maybe, it doesn't sound like it's covered. I suppose we can't be certain about that, but it would be one to definitely really dig into before you'd,
yeah, before going that route, yeah, or taking that chance. Like, the last thing that you want to do is end up in a scenario where you want to be legally recognized as a parent and discover that you undertook a procedure that wasn't in line with the legal requirements, as restrictive as they are. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. And absolutely, LGBT Ireland and Orphan, who I'm involved with, we will continue to campaign for greater coverage and expansion of the CFRA in particular. But at the moment, the best pathway is by compliance with the CFRA, and unfortunately that is somewhat limited.
Mm-hmm. And thanks, Anne-Marie, that's a good point. Yeah, I think to alert people, that's really what we're trying to do is broaden out, I suppose, the Children and Family Relationships Act to cover more situations and scenarios. And then we're also working with a coalition of groups to try and also bring forward a very broad AHR bill, which is still being drafted by the Department of Health. So there is, I suppose, work being done, and we are, I suppose, government are listening, it would seem, and they are open to broadening out those pieces of legislation, but it's going to take time. So I suppose, Anne-Marie, it's probably you again. But I suppose there's another question there from Adele, just if I want to get guardianship of my partner's son, and he's not on the birth certificate, how do I go about guardianship? Oh, and he's not on the birth certificate.
The question is unclear.
It's a bit unclear. Adele, you might just, I don't know if it's a typo in your question, but you might just re-enter it there if you don't mind. And then I'll just go to the next question from Emmett, and it's, thank you for organising the event. As a male same-sex couple only beginning to have our conversation of becoming a parent, are there any support groups that you could recommend to us? It'd be great to talk to other male couples. So there is a great group called the Gay Dads, and that's, as far as I know, it's a Facebook group. You can get in touch with them over Facebook, and I know there's hundreds of families on there and couples. That would be a good one to reach out to. And I think you can just, well, have a look now, but we can put it in the chat at the end. And then there's another question here, and this is around adoption, and I think it's good to actually talk about adoption as well, because it is obviously a pathway for some same-sex couples to have children, but it's also a way, there's, in theory, in the law, it should be possible for a second parent adoption to happen in Ireland. But unfortunately, there is some complications with that at the moment, while we're still waiting for regulation of surrogacy and other pathways. So I might go back to you, Anne-Marie, on that, but I'll read out Lucas's question. So I'm a Brazilian citizen, my husband is Irish. According to TUSLA, the only country who takes LGBT adoption is the USA, and American people are adopting kids from Brazil. Brazil is part of the Hague Convention. Is there any law that guarantees that if I adopt a child from Brazil, will I be able to register this child in Ireland as an Irish citizen? So that kind of brings up the adoption question, Anne-Marie.
Yeah, absolutely. I should say at the outset, adoption is not my area of expertise, but it is something that where the Hague Convention comes into play. It does make things a little bit easier. adoption is one of the areas where same-sex male couples can become parents. But it does have to meet the criteria of the adoption authority, and they have, I suppose, control over that process. So, I mean, it is worth trying to get additional information from them before embarking on a process, obviously, if you do want to have recognition in Ireland. We have seen issues in terms of second parent adoptions, but I think joint adoptions, it's a little bit clearer. I think the adoption authority could be able to say that a scenario is covered or it isn't in that respect.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. And then I'll just read out this question from Aoife, and is there a timeline for the narrow criteria for LGBT parents to be broadened to include surrogacy, at-home insemination and reciprocal IVF? I'm just planning to maybe wait to start a family in the hopes that we can do home insemination. But I suppose there's no point if the law won't be changing for the 5 to 10 years. So just wanted to know if there's dates set for this change. So I think we've talked about that. I'm an optimistic person. I would think, but don't quote me on it, that I hope it won't take 5 to 10 years. But I suppose, having seen that the Children and Family Relationships Act obviously was passed into law in 2015. It took us to 2020 to get that fully implemented. I don't think it'll take that long, but I'd be interested what the other panelists think. And I know this isn't to hold any of us to it, but just in terms of how you have seen law develop in this area. TJ, are you going to be brave? TJ, you're on mute there.
I suppose some of the novelty is moving out of this now. Part of the delay with the implementation of the Act was around developing processes. I mean, those processes are in place now, and you would imagine they could be adapted and refined for surrogacy. We know the departments are working on surrogacy legislation, but I'm not quite sure what priority is attaching to such legislation by government. Part of the problem right across government at the moment is the slowness of being able to get legislation through the Oireachtas because of the COVID restrictions. So we'd imagine that when they get back into Leinster House, rather than using the convention centre, that a much more normal cycle of legislative scrutiny and development will take place. There's quite a lot of legislation in the pipeline, so that's a complicating factor, as well as the complexities around the legislation itself. Benny might have been a bit more closer in terms of working on some of this stuff. Certainly from our perspective, in terms of operationalizing anything, we would like to see a more streamlined process put in place for surrogacy, and some of the imperfections in the current DAHR setup, to be remedied in any new legislation. And we've ideas around that, some of which we've got from yourselves. Look, we've heard nothing about timelines, and in fact, we have important legislation ourselves that we're not being given any signals as to when it might be scheduled for consideration by the government, and it's simply the practicalities that are coming from the way the Oireachtas is operating at the moment. And that's not necessarily a criticism, it's simply a fact of life. Like, for us all, we're operating in this crazy parallel universe. Hopefully we'll see huge shifts in that in the autumn.
And I think
I don't really have information as to the maturity of the legislation that was in discussion with us last year, or if it's been complicated by adding some other things into it. I mean, you know, regrettably, what happens is that if you can legislate for something that's really reasonably straightforward without adding in a whole other range of issues that require to be broadened, you know, that has its implications in terms of slowing down the process. You know.
Thanks, DJ. Yeah, and that corresponds, I suppose, to the latest update from this morning from the Minister for Children, obviously, is that, you know, I suppose 80% of the law in this area has to be brought forward by the Department of Health, and then about 20% by the Department of Justice. So I suppose the obvious problems now with the Department of Health is because of COVID. It's very difficult to get things progressed. The positive news is, I suppose, that there is a very strong commitment in government, that the Attorney General is working on solutions to the international surrogacy piece. We have reassurances that it's a priority. So all of that, it's really, we don't have an answer and we don't have a clear time frame, but that's the good news. And then the bad news is, I suppose, that given the global situation and the situation in Ireland, the Department of Health is under pressure, so that is delaying things even further. I agree with you, TJ. I think one of the problems now is that, not the problems, it's a good thing, but the legislation that was being drafted was only dealing with domestic surrogacy. There's now a commitment to deal with international, so they're gone back to the drawing board, is what I understand. So that's as much, I suppose, as we can say, because we don't have a crystal ball, but I think it is going in the right direction, but how long it'll be, I suppose it's hard to tell. Go on, TJ, you're on mute there.
I suppose the important thing, Paula, is to take comfort from the fact that there are people who are working on this, and there are legal drafters who are working on that, even if they are being, there are other priorities. And we know from correspondence that we receive from time to time and queries around particular aspects that it is being worked on. You know, it is
absolutely.
Yeah, we're largely being consulted as to, you know, around registration issues, but I'm hopeful when we get the communications that we know that, you know, somebody is still, you know, working away in the background on the matter. And I know Minister O'Gorman is particularly committed to seeing this through. You know, but again, as you say, there are priorities in health, and then there are priorities at government level and in the Oireachtas in being able to deal with legislation. And it's the only piece of legislation that's falling behind. That's not a comfort, by the way.
I know. Thanks, TJ. I'll just say, I'll have to read out this question and see who wants to take it, but it's I have been friends with Elle for 20 years, and we agreed to go down the route of him donating. I was single at the time, and he was still in a long-term relationship. Now I'm in a relationship, but I'm still pursuing IVF with a sperm as a partner in the clinic for the last 2.5 years. We agreed I was going to bring up the child myself, and he'd be a friendly uncle. He's Irish, living abroad full time. Now my partner and I are wondering what alternatives do we have, as me as the birth mother and her as the second mother. We both want to be parents of the child. Does that mean that he would have to give up his full rights? Or can my partner apply for guardianship and later apply for adoption? Which is best and the cheapest route? Anne-Marie, the oracle of all information.
Lots and lots of layers to this one. Just to say that at the moment, we don't have a very clear process for parents to give up their rights other than a birth mother through adoption. And I think that that is becoming an issue in terms of the recognition of known donors in particular, who are de facto, I suppose, recognized as a parent, even if they would have to assert a parental right as a father in that scenario. What I would say is, if there was any possibility of her friend donating going forward, there would be the option of a known donor in the clinical setting. And provided all the correct paperwork is used, the consent form for the donor, the consent form for the intending parents, the usual process, that could be covered under the prospective regime. But certainly using donor gametes that were created or stored prior to the 4th of May will not, will create a scenario whereby the donor in that case isn't seen as a donor, because he may have presented as a partner and is seen as the male partner in that relationship, even if there is no relationship between you and the partner. So, you know, I have to make absolutely clear here, this isn't legal advice. We're not here to give legal advice. This is information. And if you do want to consider your options further, I would recommend looking at it closely with a solicitor and planning that out. But certainly on a plain reading of the legislation, if your friend were capable of donating in a clinic as a known donor and the same process followed, that would give an opportunity for you and your partner to be registered as the parents of that child.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. I'll go to Pam now. And her question is, I was with my ex-partner 8 years, lived together and did 2 years of IVF in a Dublin clinic. We separated when our son was 6 months old, but I've been slowly pushed out of his life. What rights do I have? We did IVF as a same-sex couple. So I could be seen as a second parent. I'm heartbroken and finding it hard to get any information. Pam, I'm sorry to hear that. That's a very difficult situation. Anne-Marie, again, I think for you.
Yeah. Thanks, Paula. Yeah, very unfortunate situation, and I've certainly seen other cases where similar has happened. What I can say in that case is that there are 2 different levels of court process that are provided for with respect to retrospective recognition for any child born prior to the 4th of May 2020. So the district court process, which myself and Fiona and Paula have been through, is for consent applications. So that's where the birth mother and her partner are consenting to the partner being registered or the birth being re-registered to reflect the second parent as a parent of that child. Now, there will, and this is obviously an example of a situation where a conflict has arisen or the relationship has broken down. In cases where there isn't consent, so there isn't agreement from the birth mother, there is a circuit court process that's provided for in the legislation, and that allows for the second parent ultimately to make an application to ask the court to recognise them as a parent. Now, the only recommendation I would make in respect of anybody going through that process would be to speak with a solicitor, because it is likely to be a more complicated process. It probably is going to be a very emotional and, you know, conflicted process and acrimonious ultimately if there isn't consent there. So it highly recommend legal advice in that scenario. But just to say, the legislation does provide for recognition in those cases. Now, the complicating factors are the passage of time, and, you know, judges will absolutely have to make decisions with respect to the best interests of the child, and even other decisions in terms of, you know, access rights and things like that can come into play in those scenarios. But the process is provided for if somebody does want to.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. That's at least in terms of there is provision there and there is a rights there, and hopefully but also to say, like FLAC, if people do need legal advice and don't have a solicitor themselves, we have worked and partnered with FLAC on this, and their information you can get their free phone number, we actually, Claire will put it up in the chat there, but they definitely a good contact as well. I'll just take one more question because we are coming up to the end, or one or two if people want to put them into the chat. This is one that just has come in. Our fertility clinic said we would have to use hormones when carrying out IUI despite no fertility issues after checks. Is this legal? The fertility clinic also said we'd have to engage in all of the tests, including STI tests, blood tests, etc., even though we've had those tests done in the past. Can clients reject these tests if they have no fertility issues to avoid paying more and more money? And having done many IUIs and more than I care to remember, I feel your pain because it's such an expensive process. And I think the point being that for same-sex couples often there isn't any fertility issues. It's just that we need to access donor gametes, and also the way the law is framed, we have to access that in a clinical setting. So I don't think there is any way around that really, rather except bring it up with the clinic. I don't know, Anne-Marie, if you've any further thoughts on that, or Fiona. Sorry, Fiona.
Yeah, Paula, no, I was just going to say, I know with our experience with the clinic, they did recognize that there is no outstanding fertility issues noticed yet, you know what I mean? So we did actually have our first round IUI with no hormonal treatments. So some clinics will offer that, but they do like to actually start using the hormones pretty quick. And I think it's because it's an expensive process, so they want to try and guarantee every opportunity. So I think that's why they justify it. And the thing with the STIs and the testing like that, I think that's all patients in clinics. It's not just limited to gay patients, and I think it has to be done every 2 years or something like that. That's usually down to clinical practice.
Mm. Yeah, and that is one of the things we're really trying to advocate for, as from a legal reform piece, is to try and get some way of where couples can get legal recognition without having to go through a clinical process if they don't need it. So that's something we're very aware of and we're working on.
Like Paula, there used to be
yes.
there used to be a treatment. I remember years ago, before the CFRA was out, when we were researching IUI back in the day, there was a procedure where, for heterosexual couples, where you could do timed fertility treatments. So it literally was the female going in, and they were letting the couple know when was the best time to try and procreate. So it was literally just monitoring your cycle and monitoring your egg cycle, let's say. And I always wondered if that could have been used, or if that could have been, that service could be provided for female couples, as in that sense. So that was more like a natural IUI, but it wasn't intrauterine, it was intracervical.
Very good.
I don't know
yes.
if they're still offering that, and if that was an option, that surely should be cheaper than an IUI, because it's less invasive.
Very good. Yeah. And so just to be clear then, in terms of say if that was on offer, am I right, Anne-Marie, in prospectively since the 5th of May, if you're trying to conceive a child now, if once you could potentially use a known donor, once the consents are in place, if the clinic would offer intercervical, isn't that right? You used the term there, Fiona. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what they had it called, or timed conception. They had it for heterosexual couples. They called it timed conception.
And would that stack up, Anne-Marie, legally then for the process to follow?
Yeah. So like in terms of a DAR procedure, it's not defined then into IUI or IVF or other types of fertility treatments. And I think part of that was to try and future-proof it. You know, if they started actually including lists of procedures, they'd have to amend the legislation quite readily, you know, to try and keep up with the clinic's advancements. So they haven't actually named the procedures. It's just a DAR procedure, but it's tied to the insemination piece and the implantation or the commencement of a pregnancy out of that procedure, so the conception occurring at that particular date. So if that were offered, yes, that would. And I suppose that probably would deal with some of the issues. Like, I mean, similarly, you know, there were no known fertility issues in our case, and yet from day one we were put through a medically controlled process. Whereas I know lots of people that might prefer that isn't the case. It's part of the success rates and feeding into those statistics, absolutely. But at the same time, it's cost prohibitive. And I think one of the other areas that we'll be advocating on is in terms of even just the costs provision, you know, that we will see coverage through public purse for fertility treatments, whether we need it as a result of our what's sometimes referred to as social infertility, as opposed to medical infertility, that, you know, at least the costs would be covered, but that wouldn't necessarily deal with another objection in terms of I suppose excess interventions where there isn't a fertility need in that respect.
That's super, Anne-Marie. That's very hopeful, actually. So really, it's not so the DAR procedure isn't defined in legislation. So it's really just really important to stress the consents. It's really all down to those that the consents are in place, isn't it? And the paper trail from the clinic is there so that you can get the legal recognition.
So like a lot of from a registration perspective, yeah, the paper trail is so key, and I think Brendan has definitely emphasised that in terms of their end, that needs to be in order to be able to enable them to issue birth certs. But on the flip side, just not forgetting that the CFRA does regulate DAR facilities, so there is that aspect to it as well, and making sure that, you know, if you are going through a clinical procedure, that it is with a fertility clinic in Ireland.
Okay, thanks, Anne-Marie. So we've covered all the questions. I do want to say thank you to my colleague Claire Murphy, who's in the background doing loads of great work, and she's put up some links there in the chat. I hope people can see them. There's links to the Rainbow Family Equality Network, which Anne-Marie is part of, and Equality for Children is also a very active group for LGBTI parented families. And then our own website, lgbt.ie, get information /parenting, is also a good source of information. And Claire's put up the link to FLAC as well. There's a message from Annie in Gorth Resource Centre, and is a very active member of the Family Resource Centre network. Just wants to say thanks for such clear information, and Fiona, thank you for sharing your experience of securing your order. And just to mention another shout out to the Western Region Family Resource Centre network. They're doing amazing work. They've been actually organising around LGBTI rights since 2008, so long before it was fashionable, and also just creating safe spaces in the west of Ireland for many years for LGBTI people, providing information, and also having celebrations, because it's so important also that we celebrate ourselves and our lives and our families. So they've been doing amazing work, and I'm delighted to be part of that committee. This year has brought us to the committee via the wonders of Zoom. So TJ's put up as well there a link to gov.ie, and that's where you can find information about registering the birth of your child, or re-registration if you have a child already. So look, my last thing to say is just a massive thank you to the panelists, to Anne-Marie Whelan. I don't know what I'd do without you. As you can see, she's such an oracle of information and so accessible and generous and kind with her time. And I think for the community, Anne-Marie, we're very grateful to all the work you've done on this. To Brendan and TJ, again, a massive thank you. You've just been such a massive support, and the fact you both came here again this evening is just phenomenal show of how proactive and supportive you are to the community, and we really appreciate it. You're a shining example of public sector, leading the public sector. So thank you so much for that. And then finally to Fiona, just thanks so much for coming along, for sharing your story. And I'm so glad you got your registration in the end, and for your family and for your lovely Oisín. So look, thank you for sharing your story. Unfortunately, we're still sharing the stories. That's how we promote and share information, and it's hard to do it. And so I do really appreciate it. So a massive thank you to everyone. And TJ.
Paula, just thank you for including us. And again, a very simple email address for anybody who has queries that they'd like to throw at the GRO. Sometimes we can answer them, sometimes we can redirect, or sometimes we can venture an answer. And that's simply gro@welfare.ie. And that'll be picked up by one of the team, if not by Benny or myself. Okay.
Brilliant.
And
thanks, TJ.
You're more than generous. I mean, we get paid to do this, so really, and it's a pleasure working with yourself and your team. So, and you've always been good to us, so it's that makes it easier as well.
Thanks, TJ. Well, look, I'm going to use that line with the next public service I'm talking to. You're getting paid for this, so. No, thank you. And lastly, just to say, yeah, some people are asking, this is being recorded. We'll put it up on LGBTI.ie tomorrow, so therefore don't worry if you miss some of the links as well. That this recording will be up there. And then finally, just to say, we will produce a frequently asked question fact sheet from tonight. We have one up on the website already that we did from an earlier event, but we will update it from tonight because there was some additional and very interesting questions raised. So look, the best of luck to everyone. Thanks again for coming along, and thanks to the panel. And yes, see you all post-COVID. And Anne-Marie, I'll leave you with the final word.
Thanks, Paula. Just literally to say thanks so much for organising this event and having us all on again to talk about these topics. The wider this information goes, the better. I think the more informed people are, the better choices that we can all make in terms of becoming legally recognised as the parents to our children. But just some people might be wondering about my background and the hashtag non-tradfam. We're actually running a research project at the moment to try to ascertain how many families have been formed in Ireland or abroad by Irish citizens through donor conception, surrogacy and adoption. So if anybody listening is thinking of forming a family and has started that process or has children through donor conception, surrogacy or adoption, we'd very much appreciate if you could fill out our anonymous online survey that you can find at nontradfam.wordpress.com. So thanks a million for that, and thanks again, Paula. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. All right, thanks everyone. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
All the best.
Thanks
Bye,
for having me,
everyone.
Paula. Take care.